Liebe Kollegen, liebe Freunde, liebe Gäste, meine Damen und Herren, seien Sie ganz herzlich begrüßt zur heutigen gemeinsamen Veranstaltung des Arbeitskreises für Auswärtige Politik und des Arbeitskreises für Angelegenheiten der Europäischen Union. Wir sind überaus dankbar, dass wir in diesem traditionsreichen Europasaal eine Veranstaltung durchführen können mit ganz illustren Gästen. Und ich werde nachher noch ein paar Dinge zu unserem Hauptgast als biografische Randnotizen vortragen. Aber begrüßen Sie an dieser Stelle zunächst erstmal, bevor wir in medias res gehen, Senator Richard Black von Amerika, der heute früh hier gelandet ist und der jetzt die nächsten 2 Tage mit uns verbringt und über doch sehr gewichtige politische Wahrnehmungen weltweit diskutiert. Herzlich willkommen, Richard Black. Korrekt hätte ich sagen müssen, Senator Richard Black. Und da kommen wir auch schon zu einem wichtigen Detail, denn Richard Black als Senator ist sozusagen das, wie wir uns den typischen Amerikaner vorstellen. Gerade wenn er in der Militärzeit und dann später in der Politik Fußstapfen hinterlassen hat. Jemand, der Hubschrauber geflogen ist in Vietnam, der mehrfach beschossen worden ist, der im 1. Marine Corps gekämpft hat, aber auch jemand, der dann Jura studiert hat und an Elite-Hochschulen gelehrt hat und natürlich auch politische Entscheidungen mit vorangebracht hat auf der Ebene zwischen den Federal und den lokalen Parlamenten. Er ist, wie gesagt, Mitglied des Senats und in dieser Funktion hat er natürlich einen wunderbaren Einblick und auch Draufblick auf die Dinge, die sich momentan weltweit ereignen. Ihm zur Seite brauche ich nicht groß vorstellen für die Leute, die jetzt für uns hier im Bundestag arbeiten. Petr Bystron ist der Leiter des Arbeitskreises für Auswärtige Politik. Petr Bystron hat 2 Bücher geschrieben mit politischem Hintergrund. Eins an der Universität in Genf über den 25-jährigen Fall der Deutschen Mauer und ein Buch, was vielleicht eine besondere Bedeutung hat, weil es dieser schöne Slogan ist, Make Europe Great Again. Also er steht in dem Zentrum auch der Dinge, die wir heute Abend diskutieren. Und Petr Bystron hat zum Beispiel in seiner Zeit als politischer Schriftsteller auch den Eagle Award bekommen, der von derselben Stiftung verliehen wird, die auch Donald Trump als Förderer seiner Laufbahn sozusagen zurückblicken kann. Wir haben dann des Weiteren den Chef oder den Leiter des Arbeitskreises für Angelegenheiten der Europäischen Union, Professor Dr. Harald Weil. Harald Weil wird heute Abend zum Thema Wirtschaft sprechen, also die Perspektiven, die wir jetzt vorfinden an dem, ja, kann man sagen, seit Februar Scheideweg der internationalen Politik. Überhaupt, das scheint das zentrale Gefühl zu sein für alle, die mit aufmerksamen Sinnen durch die Welt gehen. Wir leben an einer Wegscheide politischer Wahrnehmung und politischer Gestaltung. Und wir wissen noch nicht, wohin die Reise geht. Wir wissen nur, dass ein wesentliches Kapitel der politischen Nachkriegsentwicklung im 20. und jetzt dann 21. Jahrhundert mit diesen Tagen irgendwie ein Ende gefunden hat. Es ist sinnigerweise auch eine Zeit, die 33 Jahre nach dem Fall der Mauer liegt. 33 Jahre ist für viele, auch die sich für geschichtliche Zusammenhänge interessieren, eine sehr symbolhafte Zahl. Wir starten dann auch sofort in den ersten Teil eines kleinen Begrüßungswortes oder eines Kurzreferates, damit wir alle so ein bisschen in den Abend eingeführt werden. Petr Bystron hat mich gebeten, ihm das Wort zu erteilen und ich freue mich auf dein kurzes Statement. Petr.
Ja, lieber Matthias, vielen Dank für diese schöne Einführung. Liebe Gäste, vielen Dank, dass Sie alle so zahlreich gekommen sind, und ich begrüße Sie im Namen der Veranstalter der beiden Arbeitskreise auch sehr herzlich hier bei uns im Europasaal im Deutschen Bundestag. Wir sind alle gekommen, um unseren Gast Richard Black zu hören, und deswegen werden sich unsere beiden Referate werden sehr kurz sein. Also ich möchte hier keine langen Vorträge halten. Wir werden dann genug Zeit nachher nach dem Vortrag von Senator Black auch in der Diskussion das eine oder andere Statement abzugeben. Matthias hat das Stichwort geliefert: Wegscheide oder der Scheideweg, an dem wir leben. Liebe Freunde, wir erleben einen Paradigmenwechsel, wie es ihn seit über 30 Jahren nicht gegeben hat. In den letzten Tagen ist die monopolare Welt zu Ende gegangen. Die Vorherrschaft der USA, des einzigen Hegemons, so wie sie sich nach dem Fall des Eisernen Vorhangs entfaltet hat, ist zu Ende gegangen. Wir haben über 30 Jahre hier in Europa erlebt natürlich Frieden, aber gleichzeitig auch eine Expansion des amerikanischen Einflussbereiches. Und diese Expansion ist jetzt an ihr Ende gekommen. Das Ende dieses Zeitalters kann man auch ganz exakt datieren. Es ist der 4. Februar dieses Jahres gewesen. Warum der 4. Februar? China und Russland haben ein Abkommen unterzeichnet, in dem sie genau das definieren, in dem sie erstens die USA im Prinzip als Feind markieren und zweitens, indem sie gegenseitig ihre Einflusssphären anerkennen. Das heißt, die Chinesen erkennen die russische Einflusssphäre in Europa an, die Russen erkennen die chinesische Einflusssphäre in Asien an, und gegenseitig versprechen sie sich Unterstützung bei den Bestreben der US-Amerikaner in diesen beiden Regionen, wiederum deren Einflusssphäre zu markieren. Ich halte das für sehr wichtig, weil es hilft beim Verständnis des Vorgehens und der Ereignisse, die wir jetzt erleben, auch in der Ukraine und vermutlich sehr bald auch im pazifischen Raum. Und ich bin sicher, Richard wird nachher einiges zu Geopolitik sagen können. Er hat große Erfahrung auch aus dem Nahen Osten. Ich hoffe, du wirst dann auch zur Ukraine was sagen. Wir sind jetzt mit diesem Thema über 100 Tage beschäftigt. Leider erfolgt die Berichterstattung und auch die öffentliche Diskussion sehr einseitig. Wir erleben, dass jeder, der in der öffentlichen Diskussion deutsche Interessen vertritt, zu Putins Puppen erklärt wird. Jeder, der amerikanische Interessen vertritt, wird als Retter der Ukraine hochgelobt. Beides ist falsch, nicht? Und ich hoffe, dass wir bei der heutigen Veranstaltung ein bisschen objektivere Einblicke gewinnen werden. Und ich freue mich besonders, dass Sie eben von jemandem so kompetenten wie Richard kommen und vor allem, dass es auch ein US-Amerikaner ist. Lieber Richard, herzlich willkommen.
Ja, vielen Dank, Petr Bystron. Wenn man diese Implikationen jetzt vor dem geistigen Auge vorbeiziehen lässt, sieht man natürlich, dass auch in den letzten 100 Tagen auf dem Gebiet der Wirtschaftspolitik so ziemlich alles und eingerissen worden ist, was in den letzten 20 Jahren auch als ernsthaft diskutiert werden konnte. 2 Zahlen mögen das veranschaulichen, wie sehr diese Politik, die wir jetzt in Europa fahren, in die Irre geht. Das sind Zahlen aus der letzten Woche. Und die erste Zahl ist eine 400 Milliarden große. Das sind nämlich die Verbindlichkeiten, der Schaden, der durch die selbst auferlegten Sanktionen in Europa jetzt schon absehbar sind. 400 Milliarden Euro, die fehlen für alle Investitionen für die Zukunft. Und das, was die Sanktionen eigentlich bezwecken sollten, nämlich Russland wirtschaftlich in die Enge zu treiben, hat dazu geführt, dass der russische Staatshaushalt im Vergleich zu 2021 einen Überschuss von 55 Milliarden Euro ausweist. Das heißt, es ist das Gegenteil von dem, was eigentlich beabsichtigt worden ist. Und jetzt ist die große Frage, die Engstirnigkeit, alles das, was wir in der politischen Landschaft ja als DNA unserer Oppositionspartei natürlich auch zu Recht markieren. Wo findet sich das noch? Wo müssen wir unser Augenmerk darauf legen, was passiert gerade mit Europa? Besonders wenn man zwischen dem EU-Europa und dem wirklichen Europa freier Nationen unterscheidet, brauchen wir eine europäisch definierte Sicherheitsarchitektur, eine Frage wirtschaftlicher und militärischer Art, der sich Professor Weil in einem Kurzreferat gerne zu Wort melden möchte.
Ja, vielen Dank und auch nochmal guten Abend, schön, dass Sie alle hierher gefunden haben. Ach, Europa, so titelte vor über 10 Jahren mal ein gewisser Markus Enzensberger und hatte da ein bisschen das ein oder andere Tröpfchen Essig in den europäischen Wein gekippt. Mit was haben wir es zu tun mit dem heutigen Europa? Es hat angefangen einmal als Wirtschaftsgemeinschaft und man kann sagen, so viel gleich vorweg, bis auf die 60er Jahre, das war das einzige Erfolgsjahrzehnt für Europa, wo die Zölle von einem Durchschnittsniveau, Weltzollniveau damals an die 50% eben innerhalb dieser Gemeinschaft der erstmal 9, dann 12, dann 15 und so weiter Länder auf 0 gefahren wurde. Da war das tatsächlich ein Erfolg. Das Wirtschaftsprojekt, die Zollunion 0%, hat 10 Jahre gedauert. Da war es getan, der Job. Danach kann man sagen, es ist jedes Jahrzehnt eher ein verlorenes Jahrzehnt gewesen. Man hat die Krisen erlebt, der 70er Jahre, Ölkrise 73, 79. Es ist auch gar nicht so unähnlich der Krise von heute, ja, damals durch den Yom Kippur-Krieg und durch die Erpressung durch die arabischen Staaten. Damals wurde auch übrigens die einzige Entscheidung getroffen, die man als rational und vertretbar bezeichnen kann, nämlich die strategische Erdölreserve, die mindestens 3 Monate vorhalten soll. Das ist also meines Wissens und meiner Erfahrung nach, der ich mich seit 3 Jahrzehnten mit Europa, seit der Diplom- und Doktorarbeit befasse, als einzig rationale, überzeugende Maßnahme dasteht. Nicht so überzeugend waren die Maßnahmen, die über dieses wirtschaftliche und klare, übersichtliche Ding hinausgingen, nämlich einen Fonds nach dem anderen aufzumachen. Man kann sagen, der Agrarfonds war noch vertretbar zu einer Zeit der Ernährungsunsicherheit und des Kalten Krieges, wohlgemerkt. Ja, ist es natürlich sinnvoll, wenn man ein kriegswirtschaftliches Ziel anstrebt, nämlich die Autarkie, die Selbstversorgung mit Nahrungsmitteln etc. Das war der Hintergrund, dass man einen Agrarfonds eingeführt hat. Mittlerweile ist das ein Anachronismus unter vielen. Für diesen konkreten Agrarbereich werden ja nur noch 50% der europäischen Gelder ausgegeben und die anderen 50% mit wachsender Tendenz werden ausgegeben für Subventionierung aller Art. Und das Ziel, nämlich die Angleichung, die Harmonisierung der europäischen Produktivität von nunmehr 27 Ländern, ist nie erreicht worden. Und man kann sagen, dass diese ganzen Subventionen eigentlich nur dazu geführt haben, dass die Missstände zementiert und dynamisiert wurden. Der Entwicklungsunterschied zwischen Nord- und Süditalien ist in 6,5 Jahrzehnten EU nicht aufgehoben worden. Die Fehlentwicklungen in Griechenland, die uns ja in die erste Krise geführt haben, 1981, hat in 30 Jahren stattgefunden, 3 Jahrzehnte, um eine Wirtschaft aus dem Hut zu zaubern, die eigentlich so aussieht wie die der 60er Jahre, dass nämlich die ausgebildeten Leute von heute den Weg ihrer Väter und Großväter beschreiten müssen, nämlich aus der Jugendarbeitslosigkeit in Italien, Griechenland etc. hier in die nördlichen EU-Länder zu ziehen, in der Hoffnung, hier einen Job zu finden. Wir sehen, es hat in diesen 6 Jahrzehnten eigentlich keine Entwicklung stattgefunden, erst recht nicht in den Ländern, die zusätzlich aufgenommen worden sind aus dem Süden und jetzt anstehend die Balkanerweiterung. Westbalkan soll beitreten. Hier in diesem Saal finden ja diese Sitzungen statt und auch die Delegationen von beitrittswilligen Ländern werden hier versorgt. Sie werden von unseren Politikern beredet. Ich will jetzt nicht sagen beschwätzt. Es ist irgendwie so ein bisschen wie der Verkauf von Versicherungen, dass die rundum Europa als rundum sorglos Paket gehandelt wird. Wobei wir mit der deutschen Erfahrung sagen können, eins ist sicher, die Prämie steigt jedes Jahr, siehe die Nettoleistung, die wir erbringen, aber der Versicherungsfall, das, was damit abgesichert ist, also der wirtschaftliche Wohlstand oder auch nur das Thema Grenzsicherung, da wird nicht geliefert. Der Versicherungsfall tritt nie ein im rundum sorglos Paket Europa und die Prämie steigt ständig. Das ist grob gesagt die Quintessenz und die Erfahrung von über 6 Jahrzehnten Europa. So, der Handelsvorteil ist geschwunden. Wir haben mittlerweile ein Weltzollniveau, jedenfalls da, wo keine Embargos laufen, ein Weltzollniveau für Industriewaren und nur die sind in dem Zusammenhang interessant von 5%, etwas unter 5% im Durchschnitt. Und wir sehen, das, was in den 60er Jahren richtig und wichtig war und einen gewissen Schub gebracht hat, nämlich Weltzollniveau 50%, Zollunion dagegen 0%, hat jetzt nur noch einen Rabattvorteil von 5%. Das ist der teuer erkaufte Rabattvorteil. Warum teuer erkauft? Weil wir wissen, es gibt die Geber- und die Nehmerländer, die Nettozahler, zu denen Deutschland, wo Deutschland das größte davon ist. Es wurde vor 10 Jahren schon festgestellt, dass von allen Nettozahlungen, die in der EU und Vorgängerorganisation EWG geflossen sind, Deutschland fast 50% gezahlt hat. Und das vor dem Hintergrund, dass Deutschland zu jedem Zeitpunkt, also ob das jetzt die EG der 9 Mitglieder war, der 12 Mitglieder, der 15 Mitglieder, der 28 minus 1, die Engländer sind ja jetzt draußen, also Deutschlands Anteil hat nie mehr als 1/4 des Sozialprodukts ausgemacht. Und da sehen wir schon, dass da irgendwie was faul sein könnte mit den Dimensionen. Das heißt, ein schwindender Vorteil, ein schwindender Handelsvorteil wird mit immer mehr politischem Ballast und mit der Dauersubventionierung von politischem Ballast, mit dem Aufbau von Plan- und Staatswirtschaft erkauft. Und was ist die Quintessenz? Gehen wir zurück ins Jahr 2000. Da gab es die sogenannte Lissabon-Strategie, mal wieder einer von den launigen Gipfeln, wo man sich entschlossen hatte, mal einen 10-Jahresplan festzulegen. Deutschland bzw. Europa, die Mitgliedsländer sollten innerhalb von 10 Jahren die wachstumskräftigste Wirtschaftsregion der Welt sein, wo am meisten neue Arbeitsplätze geschaffen werden, wo die Innovation so und so viel Prozent des Sozialprodukts ausmacht, wo der Handel und das Sozialprodukt stärker wächst als je zuvor. Und was war das Ergebnis? Man hat schon nach 5 Jahren feststellen müssen, und das war schon vor der sogenannten Finanzkrise, die ja eine Staatsschuldenkrise ist, dass Deutschland und Europa insgesamt das Schlusslicht in der weltwirtschaftlichen Entwicklung sind. Ja, das heißt, die eigentliche Innovation, das eigentliche Wachstum findet statt in Regionen wie Nordamerika, USA. Kleine Seitenanmerkung, in den USA würde keiner auf die Idee kommen, wir haben jetzt die NAFTA, die Handelszone mit Mexiko und mit Kanada. Da brauchen wir jetzt, um das zu optimieren, brauchen wir jetzt noch ein gemeinsames Parlament, brauchen wir einen gemeinsamen Agrarfonds, Sozialfonds, Gender, Mainstreaming, Facilities and whatsoever braucht man nicht. Und es wundert uns nicht, dass in den USA trotz der Krise, trotz den ganzen Dingen, die da auch aufgelaufen sind, ein größeres Wachstum herrscht als in diesem hochgelobten, hochsubventionierten Europa. Gleiches können wir für China und Südostasien, also die echten Wachstumsregionen der Welt feststellen. Mit anderen Worten, vieles hat eben den Anschein einer Mogelpackung. Und wenn jetzt hier unsere beitrittserpichten kleinen und großen Länder kommen aus dem Westbalkan oder jetzt die Ukraine, die ja im Turbotempo rein soll. Da kann ich dazu nur anmerken, Sie sollen sich überlegen, ob Sie nicht vielleicht das fragwürdige Glück haben, eins der letzten Tickets für die Titanic zu erwerben, wenn Sie hier beitreten. Natürlich, man hat die Dollarzeichen, die Eurozeichen im Auge auf der Brille. Man ist Nettoempfänger, man kann mit einem warmen Geldregen in Milliarden rechnen. Die Ukraine hat ja vorher militärisch und zivil 2-3 Milliarden alle Jahre wiederbekommen aus USA, aus Europa. Und was ist damit geschaffen worden? Also mit Sicherheit keine Demokratie oder Basisdemokratie, mit Sicherheit keine Wettbewerbswirtschaft. Und es ist nicht zu erwarten, dass diese EU, die in 6 Jahrzehnten in den Gründungsländern, fast 7 Jahrzehnten in den Gründungsländern oder x Jahrzehnten in den neuerlich beigetretenen Ländern auch nicht Demokratie förderlich war, auch nicht wohlstands- und wettbewerbswirtschaftsförderlich war, dass die in diesen durchaus benachteiligten Ländern mit anderer Wirtschaftskultur, Tradition und Struktur daherkommenden einen besseren Erfolg hat als in den neuen. Also es ist absehbar, dass es ein Hase- und Igelrennen ist und dass die vordergründigen Vorteile eigentlich nur eine langfristige Verschlechterung sind. Und man kann sagen, dass eine Verschweizerung der Verhältnisse Europa gut tun würde, Deutschland gut tun würde und mit Blick auf die Entwicklung in der Ukraine und in Zentralasien muss man sagen, als Perspektive, wenn es leichter ist, östlich von Moskau Schweizer Verhältnisse mit Demokratie und Wettbewerbswirtschaft und Wohlstand aufzubauen, als westlich von Moskau, siehe Ukraine etc., dann sollte man diesen Weg beschreiten und, wie gesagt, Quintessenz, eine Verschweizerung, aber nicht eine Verbrüsselung tut Europa und der Welt gut und am nötigsten. Dankeschön.
Vielen Dank, Professor Harald Weil. Ja, und jetzt zu unserem Hauptgast des heutigen Abends. Ich hatte es schon anfangs angedeutet. Was macht diesen unglaublichen Blick aus? Er ist Praktiker, aber auch gleichzeitig Theoretiker. Jemand, der als Wirtschaftsprüfer gearbeitet hat, Jura studiert hat, an mehreren Colleges auch Kriegstechnik sozusagen gelehrt hat, der Regierungen beraten hat, der sich eingesetzt hat, Nahostfriedensprozesse voranzubringen und natürlich sehr tief reflektiert und über den erforderlichen Blick verfügt, über all das, was uns jetzt scheinbar ungeordnet jeden Tag begegnet. Senator Black gehörte als Abgesandter des Bundesstaates Virginia auch dem Abgeordnetenhaus und dem Senat an in Washington. Und das ist für uns sozusagen ein wirklicher Ehrengast, dass sich jemand bereit findet, uns seine Sicht mitzuteilen. Und Sie werden jetzt sicherlich gleich sehen, das ist nicht die unbedingte Sicht des offiziellen Amerika. Umso erfreuter sind wir, dass er den Weg hierher gefunden hat. Wir lauschen jetzt seinen Ausführungen. 2 ganz kleine technische Dinge noch. Wenn Sie in Deutsch zuhören möchten, dann können Sie auf Kanal 2 das auch in Deutsch verfolgen. Und wenn der Senator Black geendet hat, besteht die Möglichkeit, dann auch noch Fragen zu stellen. Ich freue mich. Senator Black, Sie haben das Wort.
Danke. Meine Damen und Herren, es tut mir leid, aber ich spreche nur wenig Deutsch, also muss ich Englisch sprechen. I'm honored by the invitation of Professor Dr. Harold Weil and Peter Bostrom to address the members of the Bundestag today. Many thanks to Stephanie Behrens, who's done magnificent work in arranging the visit here, and also to Ben Austin, who has been very helpful with assisting in that way. I'm not speaking in any official capacity, but simply as a lifelong student of foreign military affairs, but one with a very deep love and a great respect for the German people. And so my remarks will seem to some somewhat controversial. I'm not offended by people with contrary views, but simply offer these as my own. I favor neither side in the Ukrainian war. My interest is really in the stability of Europe and avoiding a growth of this problem. My heart breaks for those killed on both sides and for the many people whose dreams have been destroyed by the war. But I will say that the war became quite likely when, under President Obama, the West acted very recklessly, and it assisted in toppling the government of Ukraine in 2014. And then when the U.S. subsequently began pouring weapons into Ukraine, a country with a very complex and very difficult past, war simply became inevitable. So I'd like to start by making the point that I'm not some left-wing pacifist. I served in uniform for 32 years. I flew 269 combat missions as a pilot in Vietnam. My aircraft was hit by enemy fire on 4 flights. I then volunteered to fight on the ground with the 1st Marine Division. And we made 70 very bloody combat patrols. I was wounded. My radio men were both killed fighting right beside me after we did a rubber boat assault across the Hoi An River to rescue a surrounded Marine outpost. So I was first a Marine pilot, and then I was later an Army lawyer. I retired as chief of the Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon, and I had testified before Congress, prepared executive orders for the President, and advised the Senate Armed Services Committee. Then later I was a member of the Virginia House and Senate for a period spanning 2 decades. With your permission, I would like to dedicate my remarks to the memory of Fraulein Johanna Sittner, a woman who cared for me when I was a boy. I think she'd be pleased by my appearance here in Berlin today. Her fiancé was a Messerschmitt pilot who died on the Russian front. She was a very beautiful dance entertainer who was trapped behind enemy lines as Stalin's forces surged into Germany. She and her girlfriend were very brutally assaulted by his troops. And as the girls dragged themselves away, she stumbled across a pistol that was lying in the gutter. She took it. And that night, the girls slept in an abandoned building. But the next day, more soldiers came, and they were looking for women. So the girls fled up the stairs. They climbed higher and higher until they reached the top story. And then they went out onto the roof, and they were determined that they would not be raped again. So they hid behind a chimney, and they agreed that they would shoot the first soldiers who came, and they would save the last bullets for themselves. So as Johanna held the pistol and she waited breathlessly, the soldiers opened the roof hatch. They looked around, but by the grace of God, they saw no one. They closed the hatch and they left. And so Johanna was able to escape, and through all sorts of adventures, she eventually ended up at my home. And so today, I dedicate my remarks to her memory. So let me begin by saying that, in my view, Ukraine has lost the war. Of course, the war is not over. The war may go on for quite a while, but in many ways, it is already lost. It's become an artillery duel. Russia fires 50,000 shells a day, 10 times more than Ukraine. The Washington Post has said that Ukraine is almost completely out of ammunition, and there are no replacements for their Soviet-era ordnance. On June the 10th, the Post reported that Ukraine is suffering 1,000 casualties a day. That includes 200 men killed every single day. That rate of casualties has doubled in a period of just 3 weeks. And let's put that in perspective. Vietnam was America's last truly bloody war. we lost 60,000 men across a period of 10 years. So about 6,000 killed per year. With a much smaller population, Ukraine is losing 6,000 soldiers killed, not every year, but every month. So this is a casualty rate 12 times higher than the U.S. sustained during Vietnam. Now, moreover, if you compare the populations, the much smaller population of Ukraine today with the much larger U.S. population back then, their casualties, Ukraine's casualties on a per capita basis, are 60 times as high as we suffered during a very bloody war in Vietnam. 60 times. Now, the Ukrainians have fought with enormous courage, but they simply cannot sustain such high casualty rates for long. In my view, Ukraine is finished. At this point, the continued slaughter of brave young men is simply tragic. On June the 12th, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg all but admitted that Ukraine would soon be forced to sue for peace. He said, the only question is, what price are you willing to pay for peace? How much territory, how much independence, how much sovereignty are you willing to sacrifice for peace? Stoltenberg's remarks suggest that NATO recognizes that this war is lost. It's become, to some, an unpleasant distraction that simply needs to be wrapped up. I'd like to briefly summarize how we reached this point. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, NATO was essentially searching for a new mission. In my view, it created the false illusion that the Russian Federation was a generic substitute for the Soviet Union. And on that premise, it began a relentless drive eastward toward the Russian border. At first, this was very controversial. Later, people came to accept it. Ukraine was essentially the final step to reaching Russia's door. Now, under President George W. Bush, we had the very fine ambassador, William Burns. He was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. And thanks to WikiLeaks, I happen to be a fan of WikiLeaks because I'm not sure how we would know anything that's happening in the world without them. But in 2008, there was a classified cable. It's no longer classified, but it was leaked on WikiLeaks. And it was from Ambassador William Burns. It was widely distributed. It went to NATO. It went to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State. He gave a very insightful summary of what was happening at this time in 2008. There was a discussion underway about Ukraine seeking NATO membership and taking out a membership action plan, which basically is sort of the first of a long series of steps towards membership in NATO. Ambassador Burns had been called in by Foreign Minister Lavrov and made the point quite dramatically. He said that Russia would view eastward expansion to Ukraine as a military threat. They discussed the fears that the issue could potentially split the country in two, because as you know, there is a very complex history with Russians settling in Ukraine, a very painful history for Ukraine, frankly, but it is what it is. And so Ambassador Lavrov described this as an emotional and neuralgic issue for Russia. And neuralgic, I actually found myself looking up to just be sure, and neuralgic is where you feel shooting nerve pains through your face, almost paralytic pains through your face. So Lavrov chose to use that. This was not only emotional, but just was a terrible blow to the Russian thought. And Lavrov said that he feared that the issue could potentially split the country in two, leading to violence or a civil war that would eventually force Russia to decide whether to intervene. Now, this is in 2008. This is a blueprint for exactly where we have come. And this was under George Bush. Now, subsequently, President Obama came along. But so here where we reached a point in 2014, so it was not that long after we had this very explicit warning, but we had a new president, we had a new team in office. And in 2014, the Central Intelligence Agency and British MI6 helped to orchestrate a violent revolution that overthrew the duly elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. He was installed by an anti-Russian revolutionary junta. So at that point, you had Crimea, and you had the two republics that make up the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk. And these places, they were heavily Russian-speaking, and they simply refused to recognize the revolutionary junta that had taken power in Ukraine. So, in response, they declared their independence. And without much delay, the new Ukrainian government began an attack on the Donbass. This commenced a bloody war that killed 14,000 people. And the world took very little notice as this was going on, leading up to the Russian intervention. It was interesting that France and Germany both recognized the growing danger that was faced, and they encouraged and facilitated negotiations among the parties. And so in 2014 and then again in 2015, Ukraine met with the Donetsk and Lugansk republics, and among the three of them, they signed peace agreements. The key really to these Minsk agreements was that Ukraine pledged that it would grant semi-autonomy to Donbass. Certainly there would be things to work out, things to make sure that Donbass could function, but Ukraine did not attempt to implement the agreements, and the agreements failed. The reason that I think they failed is that by that time the United States had begun pouring advanced weapons into Ukraine. And at the same time, NATO started teaching Ukrainians to use these weapons to kill Russians. In many ways, NATO was already conducting a proxy war against Russia, or at least preparing for one. Now, most Ukrainians really didn't want the war. They had seen a lot of war. They had suffered enormously during all of their history. So by 2019, they became very tired of the first president who was elected after the coup, Petro Poroshenko. Now, Poroshenko, even though he had overseen the signing of the Minsk agreements, he pressed the war against Donbass, and voters were very eager to seek a peace candidate. They thought that Zelensky would bring peace. He won the election against Poroshenko on April 21st, 2019, and he promised to a joyous crowd that he would reboot the Minsk talks, and he said, and I quote, We will continue in the direction of Minsk and head toward concluding a ceasefire. And the crowd cheered wildly. But Zelensky betrayed his promise, and fighting accelerated, and Ukraine began assembling a major strike force that dug multiple trench lines in anticipation of a bitter war that was about to erupt. President Putin was desperate to avoid the war. In December of 2021, now, Russia had made many overtures to explain their position to secure peace, but in December 21, he advanced specific written proposals to NATO, which took them under consideration, but eventually dismissed them out of hand. So with the hopes for peace dashed, faced with an imminent attack against the Russian-speaking Donbass, President Putin ordered his special military operation into Ukraine. Now, it's interesting to note that Russia had delayed attacking during all this time that NATO had these agreements under consideration. So by the time that NATO had clearly rejected the attempt at peace, the ground had begun thawing. And this made off-road armored vehicles attacks very difficult or impossible. And so you had long convoys of Russian vehicles that were bunched up and vulnerable along the Russian or the Ukrainian roads and highways. This was the importance of the weather. Had the ground been firm, these vehicles could have moved off-road, but they were bunched up, they were vulnerable. And no one knows the importance of weather better than the Russians. No one. Perhaps the Germans know it. Perhaps the French know it, but the Russians know it best of all. So, in my view, this delay suggests a very desperate final grasp at achieving peace by the Russians. Now, they went in, and frankly, they did not have nearly enough forces massed for an attack. The rule of thumb that all military people know is that the attacking force, where they choose to attack, should have a majority of 3-1. You learn this as a lieutenant, 3-1, 3-1. Russia attacked with less than a 1-to-1 ratio. It's a very small ratio, and the numbers are a little uncertain. But it was nowhere near the 3-to-1 that they needed. Additionally, they had the disadvantage that they were attacking under very strict rules of engagement that were designed to minimize casualties and property damage in the hopes that the Ukrainian resistance would be light, that perhaps they'd receive a lot of assistance from Russian-speaking people, and the operation would be brief. I personally think, having read some documents that were drafted by President Putin, that he had a bit of a romanticized vision of the relationship among Slavic people. And like all of us, we tend to be victims of our own history and our own viewpoint. And I think he had this vision that other Slavic people would desire to have this brotherhood with Russia. Now, instead, of course, they found themselves fighting a very determined enemy, an enemy who did not have a terribly fond view of Russians from their history under Lenin and Stalin. So before long, Russia revised its strategy to confront the very stiff resistance with greater force. Now, at the very outset, the United States rallied the West mightily, demonizing things that were Russian, censoring all contrary news coverage, and implementing unprecedented financial and trade sanctions. So where does this put us today? First of all, the sanctions have failed. Even though the entire financial might of the Western world was unleashed against Russia, and the Biden administration swore they would crush the ruble, they boasted of destroying the Russian economy, inspiring a revolution. Today, the ruble is stronger than before the war. It's been the strongest of all currencies. Russian inflation surged and peaked at around 15% and has begun to decline. But as their inflation tops out, America's and Europe's inflation has begun skyrocketing very dangerously. Biden's attempt to strangle trade with Russia has failed. The Economist reports that Russia is generating a record trade surplus, $250 billion this year, twice as much as last year. And despite the sanctions, Russia is forging ever stronger trade ties with China, with India, South Africa, Iran, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, all of which continue trading with it. We're finding that dictating sanctions policy to sovereign nations is diminishing its effectiveness and frankly, I think, diminishing the world's respect for America. From the outset of the war, the Russian people, the common people, have never experienced shortages of food, housing, heating, fuel, or gasoline. All of the essentials of life are still there in abundance. And what we're seeing is that Russia's self-sufficiency in major commodities makes it tremendously resilient to sanctions. Anyone who thinks that the Russians will crack because they lack Gucci purses or McDonald's hamburgers simply does not understand the Russian psyche. Meanwhile, the hopes of ousting President Putin have died. On March the 1st, Boris Johnson predicted that sanctions would bring down the Putin regime. Since then, Boris Johnson was nearly ousted from office through a parliamentary vote of no confidence, and at the same time, Putin's popularity has risen to 83%, which is higher than any of his Western counterparts. Meanwhile, the propaganda war has begun to unravel a bit. At the beginning of the war, the U.S. launched a carefully orchestrated barrage of anti-Russian propaganda, and all dissenting voices were blocked. Western media, including all of the West and European Union, breathlessly reported the dramatic exploits of the Ghost of Kiev, a pilot so skillful that he shot down 40 Russian jets before dying heroically in battle. But the Ghost of Kiev was a complete fiction, a hoax. He was a media concoction, a fraud who never existed at all. Another false report told of Ukrainian border guards who were trapped by the Russian Navy on Snake Island. It was reported that they refused to surrender, they cursed their tormentors, and fought to the death. Zelensky even announced that he would give every one of them the nation's highest honor, the Hero of Ukraine. But this, too, was deliberately planned as a fraud and a hoax. There were guards, but when they were confronted, they promptly surrendered. They did the sensible thing, and they were taken unharmed aboard a Russian vessel and soon returned to Ukraine as part of a prisoner swap. The use of deliberately concocted stories like these undermines Ukraine's allegations, whether it's war crimes or their own battlefield victories. It's not that they aren't to be listened to, but it it suggests that they should be listened to with a grain of salt. So where do we stand today? Now, recent news reports have begun acknowledging the likelihood of a Ukrainian defeat. On May the 24th, former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said that Ukraine should give up territory to Russia to end the war. By June the 10th, Newsweek was reporting that even the deputy head of Ukrainian military intelligence admitted that Ukraine was at risk of losing the war to Russia. And then on June the 12th, of course, we heard Secretary General Stoltenberg discussing the terms for peace as though it was inevitable. However, I will say that the Secretary General has since backtracked and is now saying that we should dig in for a long war. We'll see which of his truths turns out to be accurate. We even see now a scramble to reposition based on the direction the war is taking. Early in the war, Pope Francis chastised the Russian Orthodox Patriarch, Kirill, who explained Russia's justification for invading Ukraine. And Pope Francis cautioned, he said, you don't want to become President Putin's altar boy, rather contemptuous language. But by June the 15th, the Pope was backtracking. He admitted that the war might have been provoked. Of course, that was Patriarch Kirill's position all along. That's what he had been telling the Pope. And today, the Wall Street Journal reports that Turkey has suspended the selling of weapons to Ukraine. The Turks, you can always depend on, will be flexible in their approach, and they have a finger to the wind, and I think the fact that their finger is to the wind should be some evidence of the direction that things might be going. I mentioned also that the Americans are losing interest in the war. It's been published in a British outlet, The Express. They had a poll saying that Americans now think that the shortage of baby formula is 5 times more important than the war in Ukraine. And that it breaks my heart because in many ways, the United States has sent these young men off to die, and now we're shifting and saying, well, your death is fine, but baby formula is so much more important. Most Americans now believe, a majority believe, that the U.S. has been hurt by sanctions worse than Russia. But I will tell you that America is richly endowed by the commodities that have been cut off. Europe is not. So where we suffer from the sanctions that we have imposed, Europe suffers much more greatly. For this reason, Europe has really been one of the big losers in the war. The U.S. sanctions have been blocking the receipt of low-cost, reliable Russian gas and oil, made it much more difficult to obtain these things. The sanctions are certainly battering the European economy. And just recently in Brussels, they have been holding large demonstrations, large for Brussels, 70,000, 80,000, and they are protesting inflation, and they're protesting the spending of money on war rather than on the people. I point out that America's bizarre, long-lasting infatuation with so-called alternative energy has put pressure on Europe to dismantle its cheap, dependable, coal-fired power plants and instead to depend on fickle wind and solar power, which are notoriously unreliable and totally inadequate to power a muscular industrial economy such as Germany's. I will mention to you, I did some lengthy study to determine something is very difficult, which is to figure out not only what part of our electrical grid is solar and wind powered, but how about the entire power requirements? And I came down to the point that after 40 years of immense subsidies and political pressure, the United States has about 4.5% of its total power coming from solar and wind. It's taken us 40 years to reach 4.5%, and then people say, well, we wish, we will it to be so. We will have solar and wind, and we'll do away with everything else. It's nonsense. It's a fiction. It's superstitious. It's not going to happen. I see there are a few voices of agreement here on that point. But in any event, we have forced you into this posture, and in response, for 11 years, Germany has worked intensely, cooperatively with Russia, with some other countries, in order to put into place the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I have to. I'm always rooting for Germany. I'm hoping for Germany, and I was so pleased that the pipeline was finished. It was actually completed after 11 years, and all of a sudden, along comes the war, and pressure is put on Germany, and an enormously important project that would have a tremendous impact on the German economy was dismantled. And in my view, Germany stopped the race for reliable energy just as it reached the very finish line. It was a great tragedy, not only for Germany, but for the entire European Union, which requires reliable fuel. I worry that the actions like the halting of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline suggest that Europe is no longer fully sovereign, that it has become subordinate to the whims of London and Washington, which I see as a negative, not only for Europe, but also for the United States. Before the war, Europe functioned quite well with moderate defense budgets. Russia presented no threat. China was an important trading partner. I was quite surprised to stumble over some figures that showed that Germany, before all of this started, had 200 functional military tanks. Now, the last time that I spent long period here was at the height of the Cold War. There were thousands of German tanks. The border was bristling with weapons. And to me, the fact that Germany was relying on 200 military tanks, Americans will tell you, oh, it's because they just rely on us. No, I think certainly there's reliance on NATO and so forth. But if Germany felt threatened by Russia, Germany would not have 200 tanks in its arsenal. I guarantee you that. I should not say that to you. You are the ones who know. But I've lived through this before. However, the war hysteria has forced this unnecessary arms race and imposed continuing war taxes on you for weapons that will continue to drag the European economy into the foreseeable future. Now, ironically, this march to war has effectively subordinated the EU to NATO. And in this way, because of this ascendancy of NATO and the fact that the EU is sort of looking to them for guidance, it really has put Great Britain back into a position of dominance over continental Europe, in spite of Brexit and the fact that they have bailed out. They didn't bail out of NATO, and so now they're back in the catbird seat. So, what will happen to Russia? I think that Russia will emerge from this war a far greater power than before. They will almost certainly absorb parts of Ukraine into the larger nation. I'm hopeful that they will only bring in those portions that are heavily Russian speaking. But this is happening during a period where the West has undergone a very prolonged period of moral and financial decay. At the same time, if you look at what's happened with the Russian ruble, Russia emerged from the ashes of the old Soviet Union and developed a sound gold-supported currency, and they had very little debt. In 2020, Russia was said to have less than 20% GDP as debt. And again, you can't go in and exchange your rubles for gold, but nations can go in and exchange their rubles for gold. So it has been very strong. And this is the reason that the ruble has retained its strength. They have not relied on tremendous money printing. So you look at this and then you compare it with the profligate money printing in America and some in the EU, and you have to ask yourself, why have we ignored the lessons of the Weimar Republic when Russia has not? So here we are. We've had these enormous calls for war. I'll just summarize a few of them. We have a Republican Senator, Roger Wicker, U.S. Senator, and December of 2021, he said, don't rule out attacking Russia with nuclear weapons. He said, we won't rule out first use of nuclear action. Now, he also said, we won't rule out putting American troops on the ground. First use of nuclear weapons. What he's talking about is a surprise attack on Russia with nuclear weapons raining down on St. Petersburg and Moscow. How does this sound to people on the other side who are looking and saying, well, they're telling us to trust NATO? And here they are calling for the first use, for a surprise attack by nuclear. I'm not saying that this is a widely held view, but at the same time, Senator Wicker is very, very senior within the U.S. Senate. We had Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat from Delaware, and he said that the U.S. should send troops to fight alongside the Ukrainians. He said only the U.S. can stop Russian President Vladimir Putin. And of course, you're talking about Americans fighting Russians, and you're talking about the Third World War. Another great war. We saw the First World War. We saw the Second World War. We've tried to do everything to avoid it, but now we're beginning to forget those things. We had the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who came over here in May, and she pledged war until victory is won. Now, a week later, our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, came and they basically said, we're going to back Ukraine as long as it takes. It was sort of an open-ended pledge. Now, To his credit, President Biden said last month, he said, if we send American planes and tanks to fight, he says, that's called World War III, okay? Let's get it straight here, guys. That's the way he talks. And he said, we will not fight the Third World War in Ukraine. So he was trying to pull back some of this insane talk. But the next thing we know, his wife, Jill Biden, goes to Ukraine. She's wearing a Ukrainian flag pin, trying to drum up sympathy for Ukraine, making a tour of European nations. This has been done before. The wife of Franklin Roosevelt, she went around making similar tours before the Second World War. And Franklin Roosevelt had insisted he was opposed to the war. But then he started the Lend-Lease program that began sending shipments of arms to Europe and essentially committing the U.S. to World War II. It's interesting that several weeks ago, the U.S. Congress approved what they called a Lend-Lease Act. They used the same language that was used when Franklin Roosevelt dragged the nation into World War II, with disastrous consequences, I think, for the world. And so we don't know. So far, President Biden has been speaking the right talk, but it leaves me a bit nervous about exactly where we stand. So we see these moves, and the risk of nuclear war still remains. We keep hearing these voices, even after President Biden has spoken. Heather Connolly, head of the influential German Marshall Fund, said she does not rule out further escalation, saying the West mustn't be intimidated by Russia. And she said, we must prepare for the use of tactical nuclear weapons. That is a quote from Heather Connolly of the German Marshall Fund. I think it's important for Western leaders, perhaps the Chancellor, perhaps France could also speak out and strongly condemn any talk of nuclear war and any talk of NATO somehow being dragged into a ground war or an air war against Russia. Even referring, this was a member of the Polish parliament, just several days ago, he was referring to Finland and Sweden coming into to NATO. And there was a comment made by NATO's Deputy Secretary General Legrand. She said, well, member states are free to deploy or not deploy nuclear weapons as they please. This is suggesting to Russia that, okay, if Finland and Sweden come in, yes, you might have nuclear weapons right in Finland. This is madness. I mean, this kind of crazy talk really threatens to trigger an outbreak, perhaps something inadvertent that starts and escalates and sees us thrown into a global nuclear holocaust, something that would just be inconceivable. So we mustn't have that happen. I suggest, and this is one person's idea, and your ideas are certainly as good as mine, but I served here von 81 bis 84. And during that time, we came to East Berlin. It was occupied by Soviet troops. It would take me too long, but I will tell you the tension was immense. I walked in an American military uniform, and people were very friendly. They didn't dare to speak, but you could just see sometimes a teenager who was overly daring would go like this. He would raise a thumbs up very, very quietly. Sometimes there would be just a gentle smile or something, but you could feel from the German people that they desired to be lifted from under the oppression, and they looked at the Americans as sort of the least damaging alternative that they could seek. So we saw this. Now, in all that tension, and there were thousands and thousands of artillery pieces, tanks, everything lined up, we went also across the border into Austria. I didn't know much about Austria, the background of it, but I was delighted and surprised. We drove across, we went to Salzburg, and then we went into Vienna. They were celebrating Kris Krindl, the Kris Krindl Mart at Christmas, and it was joyous. People were celebrating, people were drinking, they were laughing, they were singing. It was prosperous. It was such a departure from anything you see in the East. And then I learned that this came about from the Austrian State Treaty of 1955. And there's confusion about how we reached this point, but during the Cold War, the Soviet Union agreed with the occupying powers, the Allied powers, that they would remove all of their troops from Austria, and in exchange, Austria would change its constitution. It would say two things. First, that Austria would remain forever neutral. And second, that Austria would not allow foreign troops on its soil, ever. I don't know how much they have abided by this. I think they abided by it strictly for a long time. But all the military forces were removed, and Austria became this dream world, this little heaven on earth in the midst of all the tensions of nuclear war. And so my suggestion would be that Ukraine begin with that as a framework, and perhaps they suggest something like this to NATO and to Russia. NATO could do a separate treaty. We could create a nuclear buffer zone that would protect both sides from some accidental thing that happens, something where some crazy Russian or some crazy American or some crazy German just flies off the handle and does something. And so a 1,000-mile buffer, 1,600 kilometers. Well, we couldn't get back. It'd be half that because we've already moved so far. But it would be a large buffer because Ukraine is large. If the Ukrainians acted soon enough before their defensive lines collapse, Ukraine might demand control over the coastal areas surrounding the port at Odessa so that they retain the ability to transit through the port of Odessa. They could also insist on controlling the capital of Kiev on both sides of the Dnieper River, because there is a portion of it that is on the east side. And then, of course, the sides could debate the limits of who should control what, but I think at least it would be a starting framework for peace and something that should be done. My heart breaks when I see the pictures of the dead Ukrainians, when I see the dead Russians. I have dragged the bodies of so many Marine dead from the white rice paddies in Vietnam. I've flown them by helicopter, and I tell you, the faces of the dead that I saw were the same as the faces of the young men that I've seen in Ukraine who have been killed in this war. The war, in my view, was totally unnecessary. It should never have happened, and had there been sound leadership, particularly from the United States, which put enormous pressure on the German government, the French government. The Brits, they're a different thing. But in any event, we have a chance, I think, to end the war and to end the possibility of nuclear war. So I thank you very much for your patience. This concludes my remarks, and I hope that it will help to forestall any World War III talk or talk of nuclear war.
Thank you so much, Senator Black, for these very emotional words at the ending of your fantastic speech. Ich kann Ihnen gar nicht sagen, wie viele von uns wahrscheinlich dankbar sind, dass Sie kommen von weit her und solche Worte sagen, die für Sie normal sind, weil Sie sie mit wachem Auge beobachtet haben. Wir, die wir uns diese Puzzlestücke mühevoll zusammensuchen müssen, werden oft, wenn wir die Seitenschlussfolgerungen ziehen, in eine furchtbare Ecke gestellt, als ob wir die Welt falsch sehen würden, als ob wir nicht patriotisch an der Seite der Freiheit stehen würden. Wir haben jetzt gerade eine Zeit hinter uns mit den Sanktionen im Covid-Regime, wo man immer gesagt hat, wir müssen Freiheit aufgeben, um Leben zu schützen. Und wir sind jetzt genau im umgekehrten Zustand, dass man sagt, wir müssen Freiheit verteidigen und dafür müssen wir auch bereit sein, Leben zu geben. Das ist einfach irre. Ich möchte für die vielleicht verbleibenden 25 Minuten einer Diskussion starten, vielleicht mit der zentralen Frage überhaupt. Wenn ich Ihre Ausführungen richtig verstehe, möchte ich angelehnt an ein Wort von Karl Kraus sagen, die NATO gibt vor, einen Konflikt zu lösen, dessen Ursache sie vielleicht ist. Die Frage ist jetzt für uns Europäer, wenn Sie uns jetzt Ratschläge geben dürften, würden Sie sagen, die Zukunft Europas mit diesem Hintergrund, aber auch mit dem Hintergrund im Irak, in Syrien, in Afghanistan, ist die Zukunft Europas in seiner Sicherheitsfrage an der Seite der NATO oder sollten wir versuchen, europäisch eigene Interessen zu definieren und vielleicht eine völlig eigene Sicherheitsarchitektur ohne Amerika zu etablieren? Das ist eine Frage, die mich wirklich sehr interessiert.
You know, I worry that NATO is so dominated by the United States. And I'm very patriotic. I want my team to win, but there are differences between the European interests and the American interests. And as you can see, Germany and France recognized the danger of war. They tried to avoid it. At the same time, the Biden administration embarked on a course deliberately designed to create war. We knew that by overthrowing Ukraine in 2014 and by then flooding it with arms and moving right to its borders, we could create a war. For the last 2 years, we have been sending nuclear-capable bombers screaming at maximum speed on attack vectors towards cities of Russia. And Russia has been forced to alert its forces to launch interceptor jets, and I'm sure part of it is so that we can detect where their defenses are, where their radars are, and so forth. But the dangers posed by this are so immense. And so I know that the new government in France, there is at least some possibility that they might break out of NATO, because there seem to be a majority of the newly elected members who lean in that direction. I don't know, but I think less reliance on NATO would be beneficial to Germany. Yes.
Thank you. So, jetzt können wir also sozusagen mal versuchen, ein paar Sachen zusammenzutragen. Als erstes Petre Bystron, danach Kollege Otten.
Ja, auch von meiner Seite vielen, vielen Dank für diese Worte, die ich glaube, uns allen aus dem Herzen gesprochen haben und für Ihre Friedensmessage, die Sie uns hier rübergebracht haben. I'm speaking.
Okay.
Just like, thank you very much for your speech. You were talking.
Excuse me, I heard a woman's voice. I was looking for a woman somewhere here.
No, I still feel as a man. You know, everything is possible in nowadays Germany now, you know, because we have some colleagues there saying they are women in spite of they are men, but they are in the Green Party. You are here by with the AfDs. Ich habe das empfunden als eine Stimme des Friedens und es hat sich wunderbar der Kreis geschlossen zu der sehr bewegenden Geschichte aus dem Zweiten Weltkrieg von Ihrer Freundin zu den täglichen, zu den Ereignissen heute. Und Sie haben es auch an 2 Stellen mindestens gesagt, dass dort junge Männer völlig sinnlos sterben. Und Sie haben angefangen, Sie haben gesagt, Ukraine hat den Krieg verloren, jetzt. Und dann haben Sie ausgeführt, warum jetzt. Meine Empfindung war, Ukraine hat den Krieg verloren, bevor er überhaupt angefangen hat, weil die USA die Ukraine geopfert haben. Und Sie haben auch gesagt, Russland war keine Bedrohung. Sie haben das auch an dem Beispiel ausgeführt, dass wir hier nur 200 Panzer haben. Und tatsächlich, wenn wir uns bedroht gefühlt hätten, hätten wir wahrscheinlich ein paar Panzer mehr hier auf dem Hof stehen haben. Das hat sich auch in der Außenpolitik manifestiert, denn es gab Gespräche schon in den 90er Jahren über eine neue europäische Sicherheitsarchitektur. Die Verträge waren fertig, sie wurden bloß nie ratifiziert. Und ab dem Zeitpunkt begann dann wieder die Zeit der Konfrontation. Und es ist die NATO, die in den letzten Jahren immer Russland als seinen Feind bezeichnet hat. Öffentlich, das ist überall zugänglich, nicht? Das wird als Bedrohung dargestellt. Und ich frage mich, meine Frage ist, jetzt haben wir den Krieg und wessen Interesse ist es, dass wir den Krieg haben? Er kam mit Ansage. Wir wussten auch, solange Donald Trump Präsident war, dass es keinen Krieg geben wird. Das war auch sein Versprechen. Und in dem Moment, wo Biden die Präsidentschaftswahl, sagen wir mal so, als er Präsident wurde, hat man schon Wetten abgeschlossen, wie lange es dauern wird, bis der nächste Krieg kommt. Also wessen Interesse ist es, dass es Krieg gibt? Denn ich glaube nicht, dass es im Interesse des amerikanischen Volkes ist, dass junge Männer sterben, egal ob Russen, Ukrainer oder Amerikaner.
There are many groups that we know. We certainly know the enormous NATO bureaucracy, who, they're all tied. Their incomes are tied to the creation of an enemy. We have all of the think tanks that function both in the United States and Britain, I'm sure in Germany. They have to have an enemy, or they can't survive. So, and then you have the military-industrial complex, which, particularly in the United States, there's enormous wealth that flows into that. But not to sound conspiratorial, but it's personally my opinion that we all talk about the New World Order, and that we all worry that sometime there'll be this New World Order that all nations will be subsumed into one global power. I believe that the New World Order is in existence and is functional today. It influences through perhaps the boys at Davos, who gather at Davos, Switzerland. 2,000 people come together. And it's interesting if you think of the dynamics of Davos. They have a small group of people who prepare the agenda. you can't function, you can't function with 2,000 people who fly from around the world, they speak different languages, and then they're supposed to come up with a direction for the world. So somebody else has to decide. That's the people who set the agenda. Perhaps a small step, I don't know, maybe 5, maybe 20. But they set the agenda, and there's one person who tells them what's going to go on the agenda. What will be the topics? Who tells that one person what goes on the agenda? I don't know. I suspect there are some very powerful banking interests. There are, who knows, there may be 5 people around the world, but there are a group of people who influence the agenda of this organization. And then those 2,000 people listen with rapt attention to what the agenda is, and they begin to talk about it. And there's an understanding, if you want to be a mega billionaire, you're going to fly back home. And if the agenda says shut down everything because of COVID, even though it doesn't really hurt people except the elderly, you could tell the elderly, go home, don't come in. If you're past a certain age, stay home. Let the rest of the world work. No. There's this global movement suddenly to shut down the entire world. Why weren't there some dissenting voices, some variations in positions? There weren't. How about the printing of money? Well, the Federal Reserve Bank in Washington begins printing money, and all of a sudden there are other banks printing money, diluting the money. Where does this come from? Why aren't there nations saying, oh no, Germany, we remember the Weimar Republic. We're not going back. But there is no Deutschmark. And now what voice do you really have within the European Union? I mean, effectively, what voice does the German who remembers what his father told him about what his father had told him about Weimar? You have no voice. And that's the problem. The grander governments become, the less reactive they are to the will of the people. And at this point, now I'm not saying that the New World Order dictates everything, every policy, or even that they desire to dictate everything. But on the big things, they control the media. They are able to send out a powerful message. During the COVID thing, I never had much interest in COVID. We never wore masks. We never got vaccines. I conducted classes for school children who continued their education while everybody else stopped being educated. And but in the midst of that, it'd been going on for 2 or 3 months. And one night I just couldn't sleep, and I decided to get up and listen to the news. I tuned in to several different news stations, and the first sentence I heard on every news station mentioned the word COVID. The first sentence. And then it went on, and the whole discussion was about COVID. So there's immense power of propaganda that exists today that is beyond anything that we had back in the Second World War under wartime, because it has such strength, the ability to communicate, and increasingly the ability to censor voices on social media. They haven't reached the point of complete exclusion, but they're racing towards it. So I think, yes, I think there is a force, and what worries me is I think the way that they are planning it is we will never know who runs the New World Order. It will simply be, it will have this facade of all the nations coming together, but we won't honestly know or be able to influence where it is, what it does. That's my concern.
Ja, danke. Auch von meiner Seite erstmal vielen Dank für diesen wirklich sehr umfassenden und auch weitgehenden Einblick in die vor allen Dingen Vorgeschichte dieses Krieges. Es wird immer in der Berichterstattung ja nur davon gesprochen, vom Tag 1, als der erste Schuss gefallen war und dass Russland die Ukraine überfallen hat. Aber diese ganze Vorgeschichte, die muss man eben kennen, was dazu geführt hat. Ich hatte ja vorhin schon gesagt in unserem Vorgespräch, dass ich Mitglied im Verteidigungsausschuss bin. Ich bin aber auch Mitglied der Parlamentarischen Versammlung der NATO, also dem NATO-Parlament. Und wir hatten vor 2 Wochen die Frühjahrstagung in Vilnius in Litauen. Da war natürlich die Ukraine das alles beherrschende Thema. Wir hatten verschiedene Zuschaltungen. Der Verteidigungsminister war zugeschaltet von der Ukraine. Und wir hatten dann auch am Rande der Tagung mit der deutschen Delegation, mit der ukrainischen Delegation ein bilaterales Gespräch unter Leitung vom ukrainischen Vizepräsidenten des Parlaments. Da kam dann in dem Gespräch die ukrainische Seite mit ihren Positionen, dass sie natürlich wieder um Waffen gebeten haben, also schwere Waffen war das vor allen Dingen das Thema zu der Zeit. Es war da auch das Gespräch gerade von dem Mehrfachraketenwerfer und dass man auch sich diese Waffe wünscht, vor allen Dingen mit der langen Reichweite der Munition, um Ziele in Russland zu attackieren, um russische Nachschubwege zu bekämpfen, die Truppen dann in der Südostukraine dann entsprechend abschneiden sollten vom Nachschub. Und als Ziel wurde da ausgegeben, ja, wir werden die Russen besiegen, wir wollen die Russen aus dem Land werfen, wir wollen die territoriale Integrität komplett wiederherstellen als Ziel. Jetzt haben Sie natürlich auch eingangs schon gesagt, dass die Ukraine massiv Personal verliert. Ungefähr ca. 400 bis 500 Mann werden pro Tag getötet oder außer Gefecht gesetzt dort. Eine sehr hohe Verlustrate, ca. ein Bataillon pro Tag als Verlust. Und die Ukraine wird diesen Krieg nicht gewinnen können. Jetzt ist die andere Seite des Ziels die USA, die Rolle der USA in diesem Konflikt. Das ist ja schon etwas angesprochen worden, auch von Burns, der ja mittlerweile CIA-Direktor ist. Wurde ja schon erwähnt, aber es wurde auch erwähnt von Ihrer Seite, dass der Verteidigungsminister Austin erwähnt hat, es in diesem Ziel darum geht, Russland nachhaltig zu schwächen, dass Russland nicht mehr in der Lage ist, solche militärischen Operationen auf mittlere oder lange Sicht durchzuführen. Jetzt von meiner Seite die eigentliche Frage, was glauben Sie, wann dieser Zeitpunkt erreicht ist? Wann werden die USA der Ukraine sagen, setzt euch jetzt an den Tisch, jetzt ist Waffenstillstandsverhandlungen angesagt, jetzt sind die Friedensverhandlungen angesagt. Was glauben Sie, wann ist der Zeitpunkt? Wann wird es kommen?
Yes, that's an excellent question. As I mentioned, the casualties that Zelensky himself admitted to, 1,000 men a day, 200 of them killed. So Lloyd Austin talks of weakening Russia. I don't think there's any sign that we are weakening Russia. Now, certainly, they're taking casualties, nowhere near like the Ukrainians are today, but initially they took a lot of casualties. I think they suffered significant losses. I think by now the Ukrainian casualties are much, much greater than theirs. But in the scheme of things, you think of the Second World War, there were battles where 1 million men were captured in a single battle on both sides. I mean, enormous numbers. So let's say that 50, 70,000 men have been killed together. Well, if you think of it, you put it in perspective, that's not a tremendous number. But Ukraine is losing its best fighters, the ones whose grandfathers, great-grandfathers fought with the Germans who had liberated them from Stalin. And so, again, you have this complex history that people don't understand, why the Ukrainians feel the way they feel. But sort of the the cream of the youth of Ukraine is being destroyed systematically, and meanwhile, Russia has not mobilized. It's made a few little adjustments to bring some more troops in, but they have the power to mobilize and to bring enormous resources to bear that they have not. I really believe that Secretary Austin's view is not correct. I do not believe that we are helping ourselves by this imagining that somehow we're weakening Russia. Every day we fight, Russia grows stronger. And honestly, when it's all finished, I think I would probably advise that Germany has more than 200 tanks. And I hate it. I hate that. I loved it when you could have 200 tanks, when you had this trade. But I think to some extent an opportunity has been lost. I wish, and I had hoped so much that the early signals from the Chancellor, he was indicating sort of a more neutral posture from Germany, that you would sort of draw back, not completely, but draw back. And then there was a sudden change, and all of a sudden weapons are being sent. And I think that's sad, because you were the link to Russia. Two nations that had experienced this enormous pain and suffering, that both understood that they had an opportunity to link, to sort of bring Russia into Europe, and which has long been their dream. But where we are now, we've lost some of that ability, but I think we need to try to restore as much as we can.
Vielen Dank. Die nächste Frage stellt Stefan Keuter.
Hello, Mr. Black. It's me speaking, a male voice. Thank you very much for coming here to us and talking to us. It was a great pleasure for me listening to you. You helped calibrating my geopolitical compass here. So we are in a technicolor parliament here, and it's very, very nice listening to conservative arguments. Well, I have two questions. First, the massacre, so-called massacre in Bucha. Do you really think that the Russians committed war crimes like this? This was the point. Most of the European countries stepped into the war and declared to be willing to deliver heavy, so-called heavy weapons. This is the first question. And the second question is, do you think that Mr. Putin, the president of Russia, is stupid? This is what German media is telling us. Or do you think that there could be a bigger idea behind all of this, like kicking the US out of the so-called petrodollar, the leading currency for oil and gas payments, together with the Chinese? The first deals have been settled on Japanese renminbi now, and the payment for gas or oil is made in the ruble, Russian currency. Do you think that there could be a plan introducing partially or fully gold-backed currency, for example, and taking over the lead role for the clearing function for energy supplies?
Yes. I wasn't going to go into this because my view is, I don't know for certain what happened at Bucha, but I speak as a career prosecutor. And when I saw the events in Bucha, they seemed rather disconnected. First of all, the mayor of Bucha announced joyously that the city was liberated, and he made no mention of bodies or slaughters or anything of that sort. It wasn't until the Ukrainian troops had been there for 4 days that suddenly there was a video put out. And the video was of a vehicle driving down a road, and there were bodies dispersed at random intervals. And the bodies were zip-tied. And it struck me as quite odd, because I thought, what a strange place to kill someone. If you were going to execute people, I've seen many mass executions because I've followed the Syrian war very closely, and the terrorists have often committed very large-scale slaughters of Christians, of Syrian army personnel. And usually they're grouped in one place. If the Russians had wanted to slaughter people, they were there for a month or two. They could have taken them off in the woods somewhere secretly, gunned them down, put them in a pit, camouflaged it. Nobody would know the difference. Why do they do it right out in the open as they're leaving? What was the motive of the Russians to kill people on the way out? I mean, they've been there for all this time. They had an opportunity to kill people. Why did the bodies appear 4 days after the Russians are gone? And why are they at random locations along the road? Something else, the civilians would always try to avoid being hurt by wearing an armband. And if you were a Ukrainian sympathizer, you would wear a blue armband. If you were just neutral, or if you were sort of Russian leading, you would wear a white armband. So why were all the armbands white? Why weren't the armbands blue? Why weren't they all blue? Those were the ones who sympathized with Ukraine. So these are very, very odd questions that struck me. Honestly, I often sent prosecutors out. We'd have evidence of some horrific crime, and I would say, I'd sit in a room, we'd have, 6 or 8 people from the prosecution, criminal investigation, the Polizei, the FBI, whatever, and I'd say, I have a hunch that this happened. You check that out first. Maybe I'd be wrong sometimes, but often my first hunch was right. If I were conducting one of these meetings after Bucha with the little evidence that I had, I'd say, I've got a hunch that maybe what happened after those Ukrainians were there for 4 days is they found out which of the civilians had cooperated with the Russians, and they executed them. And then they placed them along the road so that they would be the evidence. Go and check on that. Now, I'm not suggesting that I know for certain the answer. But after this initial claim of war crimes that immediately was blamed without question on the Russians, then there were many other people who were found dead. And I'm sure that in the battle between Russia and Ukraine, there were many civilians who were casualties of war, just not casualties of a war crime, but just, you fire shells and it hits some innocent person. So I suspect a lot of it was that. But the important ones were those first ones that were blamed on the war crime. So I don't know the answer, but I'm telling you that it strikes me as a lifelong prosecutor who's dealt with thousands of cases. It struck me as peculiar and not convincing at all that you could immediately just pin it on the Russians. The Russians did it. I'm not convinced.
Vielen Dank. Wir sind jetzt bloß, was die Organisation betrifft, in einer Zeitschiene, wo wir danach noch herzlich einladen auf einen kleinen Stehempfang. Auf diesem ist es dann auch möglich, noch mit Senator Black in persönliches Gespräch zu kommen. Wir haben deswegen als letzte Fragemöglichkeit hier in diesem Raum Malte Kaufmann.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank, Senator Black. Das war wirklich hochinteressant, Ihren geschichtlichen Abriss auch zu hören, die Hintergründe, auch Ihren Einblick. Jetzt habe ich eine Frage, und zwar, man könnte ja auch auf dem Standpunkt stehen, und so wird es uns hier ja auch vermittelt, dass Staaten selber das Recht haben, ihre Bündnispartner zu wählen und dass die Ukraine ein souveräner Nationalstaat ist, den man auch unterstützen muss gegen so einen Überfall. Und zweitens, Putin hat ja auch mal gesagt, dass der Zerfall der Sowjetunion einer der größten geschichtlichen Fehler war. Und man könnte die Angst haben, dass er praktisch mit der Ukraine jetzt anfängt, die Sowjetunion wieder aufzubauen und dass vielleicht eine der nächsten Länder Estland, Lettland, Litauen und andere sind. Was sagen Sie dazu? Und wie sehe Ihre europäische Friedensordnung aus?
Yes, it's a very good question, and I think there's been some shift. I don't think he planned the attack for very long. I mean, obviously they planned the attack, but I don't think they planned it the way that you would plan some major invasion that was about to take place. There was no mobilization. It was somewhat thrown together. And so I don't think that he had any plans to go beyond what he started off. But I think I mentioned to you earlier, I read something that was beautifully written, and I'm sure that Putin, it reflected exactly his views. I think he probably wrote much of it himself. And it was written from a Russian perspective. It put history into a Russian perspective. Even though it very harshly condemned communism, it just reflected some things that I disagreed with. And someone asked me, well, would you put a little note to him, well done? It was very well done, but it said some things, not hostile, it's sort of an interpretation of the war with Germany that I felt very uncomfortable. I was not willing to sign something that would condemn Germany and sort of in the way that this was. I just wasn't going to do that for the same reason that I love the people who landed at Normandy Beach on D-Day. I understand why they recognize that date. But at the same time, Germany has been our ally for 75 years. And I simply don't celebrate D-Day. It's not a victory for me. It's a victory for the old men who served. I'm not a very young man, but the men who served are very old men at this time. So, but I think Putin is extremely intelligent. He's not a madman. There's no mad Vlad. I've watched him since his very earliest days, but I think what's happening is because of this war, to some extent, we've let the genie out of the bottle, and Russia is being reminded of its fundamental powers, which lie in its natural resource base. I think the job of NATO at this point is to put some bright lines in place. Defensive lines, not offensive lines, but defensive lines. Just as Russia had its red line that it could not accept, and I understand it, but at the same time, there need to be lines that we can't allow to be crossed. Now, at the same time, we can't be doing stupid things. Lithuania just imposed an embargo on goods that are coming into Kaliningrad. It's insane. Why do they have to, put a stick in someone's eye at this difficult time? Calm these things down. And I know this was approved. Apparently it was coordinated with the European Union. Don't do these things. We don't need them. I'll give you a brief example of how sensitive we were. At the height of the Cold War, there were several families of Army lawyers like me, and they took a trip into East Berlin. They went on the corridor. We were under strict instructions. You were never allowed to speak to the Russian guard who came around your car when you'd stop at the checkpoints, and he wasn't allowed to speak to you. And while they were driving, they stopped at the checkpoint, and one of the wives, very innocently, just wanted a record of, here's the Cold War, and so she snapped a picture of the Russian guard. That night, Russia informed the United States that this had happened. Within 24 hours, the 3 officers, their wives, their children, all of their household goods were on board planes to the United States, never to return. The reason for this was we didn't dare do things where somebody suddenly throws a punch at somebody, and then a couple of guys jump on, and the next thing somebody takes a shot, and then somebody moves some troops in to rescue, and we end up in the Third World War. Now, this, many of you are too young to remember this, but maybe all of you are too young to remember, but I felt this. I felt it. We took our children so that they could see East Berlin. And when we got back, they announced on the radio that there was an old East German man who hadn't seen his brother since the war. It's been, this was in the 80s. He hadn't seen him since the war. They met at the fence. They said a few words to one another, and the brother was beaten to death. So you can see, these examples will give you some idea of the tensions that were there and the tremendous efforts made to avoid those tensions exploding. Today, the United States has been involved in identifying the locations of Russian generals. We've now killed 13 Russian generals, a combination of Americans and Ukrainians, and we targeted and sank the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. This is madness. It's insane. President Biden became angered that there had been a press release that they leaked the fact that we had done this. But I would suggest that the problem was not the press leak. The problem was the actions themselves. Absolutely. We're inviting thermonuclear war.
Ja, also ich kann das nur noch mal zusammenfassen. Wir können gar nicht ausdrücken, wie dankbar wir sind, dass Sie uns in verschiedenen Sichten bestätigt haben. Für die, die noch Zweifel hatten, vielleicht auch, dass die Augen weit geöffnet worden sind, genau hinzuschauen. Wir möchten uns bei Ihnen bedanken und wir tun das auch nicht irgendwie, sondern wir haben uns spezielle Dinge ausgedacht. Wenn Sie schon mal in Berlin sind, gibt es also zum Beispiel ein Stückchen der Berliner Mauer und es gibt auch ein schönes Buch über den Deutschen Bundestag. Und vielleicht könnt jetzt Professor Weil und Petre sozusagen mal zu einem offiziellen Dankesfoto. Von unserer Seite nochmal einen großen Applaus fürs Kommen.